The meeting was scheduled for 2:30 in the afternoon. Dean Martin arrived at 2:28, which meant he'd been sitting in the car outside Bally's casino for at least 20 minutes. The driver knew better than to ask questions. Dean had spent the better part of a year barely leaving his house in Beverly Hills, and now, for reasons the driver couldn't begin to understand, he'd agreed to come here, to Las Vegas, to the place that had made him, broken him, and was now preparing to replace him. The casino wanted his blessing. That's what they'd called it on the phone. A blessing. As if Dean were some kind of priest instead of what he actually was. A 71-year-old man whose son had been dead for 14 months and whose last professional performance had been walking off stage mid-show because he could no longer remember why he was standing under those lights. Inside, the casino smelled the way all casinos smell: recycled air, cigarette ghosts, and the particular desperation of people convinced their luck was about to change. Dean moved through it like a man walking underwater. Security guided him past the slot machines, past the blackjack tables where he'd once played until sunrise, past the cocktail waitresses who were young enough to be his granddaughters and who smiled at him with a kindness that was worse than pity. They took him to a conference room on the 3rd floor. Neutral territory, the kind of room where contracts were signed and careers were ended, where the machinery of entertainment ground forward regardless of who it consumed. The young man was already waiting. His name was Tommy Castellano, and he was 28 years old. He stood when Dean entered, and the movement was so familiar it made Dean's chest tighten. The way Tommy rose from the chair, the angle of his shoulders, the slight tilt of his head, it was like watching a recording of himself from 40 years ago, except the tape had been cleaned up, digitally remastered, made perfect in ways Dean had never been perfect. "Mr. Martin," Tommy said, and even his voice had been trained to match. That same effortless baritone, the casual warmth that made strangers feel like old friends. "It's an honor." Dean nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak yet. The casino executives were there too. 3 men in expensive suits who smiled too much and spoke in the language of brand management and legacy preservation. They explained the concept as if Dean hadn't already heard it, as if the idea of being impersonated while still alive was somehow a compliment rather than a preview of his own funeral. A tribute to Dean Martin, they called it. 8 shows a week. Tommy would sing Dean's songs, tell Dean's jokes, move through Dean's mannerisms with the precision of a skilled craftsman recreating a famous painting. The show would run indefinitely. Long after Dean was gone, Tommy would still be here, keeping the memory alive. Keeping the memory alive. That's how they phrased it, as if Dean were already a memory instead of a man sitting 10 feet away from them. Tommy had a portfolio. Photographs from previous performances, reviews from smaller venues where he'd honed the act. In the pictures, he wore Dean's tuxedo style, the narrow black tie, the perfectly tailored jacket, the pocket square folded just so. He'd studied Dean's posture, the way Dean held a microphone like it was a glass of scotch, casual and essential. He'd even copied the gesture Dean used to make when he forgot lyrics, that little self-deprecating shrug that told the audience he was in on the joke. But Tommy hadn't lived any of it. He didn't know what it felt like to grow up in Steubenville, Ohio, the son of an Italian barber who barely spoke English. He'd never worked the steel mills, never boxed for money under a different name because his father thought fighting was shameful. He'd never stood in front of hostile audiences in third-rate nightclubs, perfecting his craft while people talked through his songs. He'd never been poor enough that fame felt like oxygen, never hungry enough that success became the only acceptable outcome. Tommy knew the gestures. He didn't know the reasons behind them. Dean listened as the executives outlined their vision. They spoke about preserving an era, about introducing classic entertainment to new generations. They used words like timeless and iconic, and every word felt like another shovel of dirt on a grave Dean hadn't realized he was lying in. When they finally stopped talking, there was a silence that no one seemed prepared to fill. "Would you like to hear him perform?" one of the executives asked. "Tommy's prepared a few numbers. We thought you might enjoy." "No," Dean said quietly. It was the first word he'd spoken since entering the room. The executive blinked. "Oh, well, Of course, if you'd prefer to just... I'd like to talk to him, Dean said, nodding toward Tommy. Alone. The executives exchanged glances. This wasn't part of the plan. Plans could be controlled, managed, kept on schedule. Private conversations were unpredictable, but Dean wasn't asking permission. After a moment, the executives stood. They shook Dean's hand with the kind of careful respect people reserve for the terminally ill, then filed out of the conference room, closing the door behind them with a soft click that sounded remarkably like a lock. Dean and Tommy sat across from each other in the sudden quiet. "You're good," Dean said finally. "I can tell. You wouldn't be here if you weren't." "Thank you," Tommy said. There was genuine gratitude in his voice, but also something else. Uncertainty, maybe. The discomfort of meeting the man you've been pretending to be. "How long you been doing this?" "The act? About 5 years. Mostly smaller venues, corporate events, some cruise ships." Dean nodded. 5 years. Tommy had spent half a decade studying how to be someone else, and now he was being given a permanent stage to do it on. "You married?" Dean asked. The question seemed to catch Tommy off guard. "Engaged. Getting married next spring." "Kids?" "Not yet. Someday." Dean looked at him for a long moment. Tommy was young and healthy and full of plans for the future. He had his whole life ahead of him, including the part where he'd make a career out of performing Dean's past. "Let me tell you something about that act you've perfected," Dean said. His voice was still quiet, but there was something in it now that made Tommy sit up straighter. "The drinking. You do that part, right? Stumbling a little bit, pretending to be half in the bag?" "It's part of the character," Tommy said carefully. "The lovable drunk. People expect." "It wasn't a character." Tommy went still. "I drank iced tea on stage," Dean continued. "Everyone knew that. It was part of the bit, the whole act. But here's what they didn't know. After the show, in the dressing room, alone, that's when I actually drank. That's when I needed it. The character was sober. The man was the drunk." Tommy didn't say anything. "And the jokes," Dean went on. "The casual, don't give a damn attitude. You know why that worked? Because I actually didn't give a damn. Not about the casino bosses, not about the critics, not about any of it. I cared about the song. I cared about getting it right. Everything else was just noise." He paused, looking at the young man who'd learned to mimic his movements, but couldn't possibly understand the weight behind them. "You're going to stand on that stage 8 times a week and do me," Dean said. "And you're going to be better at it than I ever was, because you won't be carrying any of the things that made me who I was. You won't have the doubt. You won't have the fear. You won't have the knowledge that every time you walk off stage, you're one show closer to being forgotten. Mr. Martin, I don't think..." "My son died," Dean said, and the words came out flat and final, like a door slamming shut. 14 months ago, military jet crash. He was 35 years old. Tommy's face changed. Whatever he'd been prepared for, it wasn't this. "I was doing a show when I found out," Dean continued. "Not here. Different casino. Someone pulled me off stage and told me, just like that, 'Your son's dead.' And you know what I did? I went back out and finished the show. Because that's what Dean Martin would do. That's what the character would do." His voice hadn't risen. He wasn't crying. This was just information, delivered in the same calm tone he'd used to order drinks or discuss the weather. "I haven't performed since," Dean said. "Not really. I tried. Went through the motions a few times, but I couldn't remember the lyrics anymore. Couldn't remember why any of it mattered. So I stopped. And now they're bringing you in to do it instead. To be the Dean Martin who can still sing, who can still smile, who doesn't forget the words." Tommy looked like he wanted to say something comforting, something appropriate, but there was nothing appropriate to say. "When you're out there," Dean said, "doing your impression of me, you're going to make people happy. They're going to applaud and laugh and leave the casino feeling like they've been transported back to some golden age that probably wasn't as golden as they remember. And that's fine. That's good, even. But I need you to understand something." He leaned forward slightly. "You're not bringing me back. You're not preserving anything. You're creating something new. A Dean Martin who never got old, never got tired, never buried his son. A Dean Martin who exists in permanent 1965 when everything was still ahead of him and nothing had gone wrong yet." "I know I can't be you," Tommy said quietly. No, Dean agreed.